I've posted some outlines around here because this is a PhD thesis in 45 minutes, and I don't want to confuse anybody. I'll be talking specifically about three characteristics of American Christian doctrine. When I say American Christian doctrine, the country until the 1870s or 1880s was virtually exclusively Protestant, and more than Protestant, it was made up of the independent and dissenting minds of England, and Germany, not the state church people. So before I begin, I'd like to I should recognize every single one of you, but there are people in the audience, believe it or not, from Yale Divinity School. Could I see where they are? Or they're hiding out? There they are, way in the back over there. I was unaware that Yale Divinity School actually believed in God, so I'm glad to see they came to hear a Christian lecture. When the Puritans arrived in Salem in 1629, and I should tell you, I work from a script because I'm an Italian, and you can't let an Italian ad-lib. You can't do that. When the Puritans arrived in Salem in 1629, there were no Anglican church officials around to approve the selection of their church authorities. That would have been mandatory in the state church of England. So the first congregation here took that responsibility illegally into its own hands. That simple revolutionary act subverted power that traditionally had belonged to some certified expert and placed it into the hands of people who simply went to church. The sole yardstick of suitability for high office was that the seeker be the choice of ordinary people whose only proof of competence was joining a congregation which took religion seriously. That was it. History dubbed this quiet insurrection the Salem Procedure, and for the next 231 years, that simple public shedding of traditional authority, which was an act of monumental localism, challenged the right of arrogant power to broadcast any centralized version of the truth without argument. In the face of widespread moral and intellectual collapse in what is mistakenly called public education, we are being asked once again to patiently try a variety of expert solutions, whether by James Comer, Ted Sizer, Chris Whittle, the National Education Association, or any of a large number of fronts for institutional players, some honorable men, some dishonorable men, but all clamoring to manage the lives of children in various profitable mass compulsion schooling schemes. Plato once said, "Nothing of value comes from compulsion," but pass that by for a moment and concentrate on the new Praetorian Guard who claim the right to drain all the children from the community like Pied Pipers. They come from a very few selective universities, from less than 12 private foundations, from the boardrooms of about 30 global corporations, from a handful of think tanks, from a few government agencies whose operations are shielded from the view of the public, and from various other national associations. This is a body like the ephors in ancient Sparta, who ruled the public sphere from behind a screen of dummy legislators. The reforms of these reformers appear to be very different in nature, representing different constituencies, but do not be fooled. Just as we have not had a two-party political system for a long time, perhaps since the power to issue currency was stripped from the House of Representatives and placed in the hands of private bankers, all the narrow set of cronies who float national school reforms belong to the same clubs, read the same magazines, send their children to the same private schools, address each other by first names when they meet in Chevy Chase or Cambridge, Palo Alto or Boulder. You could never mistake any of the comfortable experts who have appropriated the right to speak for ordinary people, and many of them are honorable men, for the people who thought God was more important than anything and who built the New England congregations. Congregations were never universal. They were always intensely local. Particular men and women were attached to them who knew their fellow congregants by name and by family history. They were not mere networks of pious people who met whenever it was convenient. They cared about each other, not about humanity in general. If a congregation had a school problem, it would not welcome outside intervention unless it asked for help. These places insisted upon their God-given right to do things their own way, to make their own mistakes. I don't think you can grow up unless you're allowed to make your own mistakes. Were some of these congregations bad places? Of course they were. Some of them were horrible. But think hard about this. At least the damage stopped abruptly at the boundaries of a single church. That's the difference between a congregational reality and a state church system, or indeed any systematic universal governance. A system won't let you walk away, while a congregation says, good luck and good riddance. We are far from a time when we trusted each other or ourselves enough to make way in congregations without surveillance. Since the Civil War, a century and a half of increasingly suffocating expert interventions in our schools has left us thinking there isn't any other way to do things. To get something done, Harvard has to be called in, or Stanford, or Yale, or the Carnegie Corporation. Official strangers decide everything important, sometimes with token local voices allowed to ventilate before the prearranged decision is published. Often not even that bone is tossed. Nor is there any target for our children to aim for in this society but the approval of official strangers. That's a major reason our families fall apart. How can children respect their own parents when those sad souls are regularly contradicted by various agents of the state, most frequently by the school hierarchy? Our parents have been made childlike by honorable people. The Salem procedure of picking lay people, of letting them pick their own experts, and then keeping an eye on those experts because the congregational polity was small enough to allow that, has a kinship to the powerful vision of the Anabaptists, a vision which lives on in the spectacularly successful, spectacularly prosperous Amish communities which have driven the governments of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin livid with rage because of their successes this past century. But it also draws from a well of common sense innate in people who actually work instead of talk for a living. Small farmers, craftspeople, teamsters, artists, fishermen, loggers, small entrepreneurs, people who maintain an intuitive understanding of the fakery lurking near any expert claim to superior wisdom. And I'm being precise there. Going to college can help you be knowledgeable, but it cannot make you wise. The American genius was to locate wisdom in ordinary people, where every other government on earth located it in an aristocracy, a theocracy, a military class, a merchant class, or in civil service experts. And those who know Thomas Hobbes will recognize where I'm coming from on that. The failure of forced monopoly schooling to check our slide into despair and moral chaos allows me to demand the subordination of the expert voice once again, on the grounds it has had a century's monopoly reign and has produced a bankrupt leadership with not the slightest idea how to get us out of this mess we are in, except to ask for more money, more power over our children, a sorry elite who are making currently a desperate effort to turn the leadership of our schools over to men and women who sell soap for a living or cigarettes or processed food. That's what school-to-work legislation is, of course. It's time to turn the school business back to people, where the Constitution vested it in the 10th Amendment. It's time to let any small group that wants to try to show what it can do in schooling. 1 million family schools over the past decade have demonstrated that uncertified parents, many of them in modest circumstances and lacking the benefit of college themselves, can pin back the ears of the best factory model schools, public or private. The congregational principle is a spiritual force propelling the maximum number of people to reach their full potential by vesting everyone with an identity and a voice at the policy table, and doing it in voluntary associations with members who feel in harmony with one another. That's the way the Council on Foreign Relations works. That's the way the Ad Council works. That's the way the Business Roundtable works. That's the way the Sidwell Friends School that Mrs. Clinton's daughter goes to works. That's the way Groton and St. Paul's works. And that's the way public schools will work best too. If you think about this, you begin to wonder what purpose is being served by arranging government schools any other way. The Congregationalists knew that good things happen to the human spirit when it is left alone to make its own curriculum. No two congregational churches ever got together. This is for my wife. They had contempt for the Presbyterians because that denomination met once a year in a group synod. The congregations did not officially compare notes. They didn't inquire about each other's doctrinal purity. They had no universal management. Some were good, some were horrible, but each was sui generis. Each was sovereign. And what was the result? The forms, the spirit, and the leadership of New England during its congregational period produced the only coherent regional culture this nation has ever seen, with the Anglican Tidewater South a distant second. Listen to this. New England ships were selling ice cut from local ponds to India, if you can believe that, ice, long before you could take a train from Boston to New York. 98% of the Massachusetts population could read, write, and count quite well before the legislature, at the urging of a new industrial business establishment, coal mining and railroad interests like the Peabody families, and real estate interests eager to exploit the empty land to the west, rammed through a compulsion school law. It's true they fronted zealots, and Horace Mann was not a zealot. He had been offered a seat in Congress if he fronted this operation. 100% of the Connecticut population was literate too, without forced schooling. We have never reached that degree of literacy again, although we were close to it in 1941, when under cover of World War II, the nation's schools abandoned wholesale the brilliantly efficient reading method which had been used for centuries, and gradually replaced it with a system certain to fail, again I'm being precise, certain to fail in the dramatic hothouse of a classroom. That was the congregational principle, and now we're on part 2 on the charts, disciplinari et discipulis. Wherever I go in the United States these days, and I travel constantly this past 6 years, I hear of something called the crisis of discipline. How children are unmotivated, how they resist learning. That is nonsense, of course. Children resist teaching as they should, but nobody resists learning. However, I won't dispute that schools are in chaos. Even the ones that seem quiet and orderly are in a kind of moral chaos beyond the power of journalism so far to penetrate. And restless children underline the school's failure, so they come to public attention and they must be explained some way by authorities. I don't think it's off the mark to say that all of us, whatever else we may disagree upon, want kids to have discipline in the sense of self-control. That goes for black mothers in Harlem, where I taught for 5 years, despite the secret religion of schooling, which believes those mothers are genetically challenged. But we want more than behavioral discipline. We pray for discipline in the more specialized sense of intellectual interests well enough mastered to provide joy and consolation all our lives, and maybe even a buck, too. The discipline is what people who drink Chablis instead of Pittsburgh red whiskey call a field of learning like chemistry, history, philosophy, etc., and it's lore. The good student is literally a disciple of a discipline. The words are from the Latin disciplinari and discipulus. And by the way, I learned all this stuff from a school teacher in Utica, New York named Orrin Domenico, who writes me, and I pay attention. In this discipline matter, I'm Orrin's disciple. The most famous discipline in Western tradition is that of Jesus Christ. That's true today, and it was true 1,500 years ago. And the most famous disciples are His 12 apostles. What did Christ's model of educational discipline look like? Well, attendance wasn't mandatory, for one thing. Christ didn't set up the Judeo-compulsory school system. He issued an invitation, follow me. And some did, and some didn't, and Christ didn't send the truant officer after those who didn't. So, as Orrin tells me, the first characteristic of this model is a calling. Those who pursued Christ's discipline did so out of desire. It was their own choice. They were called to it by an inner voice, a voice we never give students enough time alone to possibly hear, and that's more true of the good schools than it is of the bad ones. Thank you. The second characteristic of Christ's discipline was commitment. Following Jesus was not easy. You had to drop everything else, and there was zero chance you could get rich doing it. You had to love what you were doing. Only love could induce you to walk across deserts, sleep in the wilderness, hang out with riffraff, and suffer scorn from all the established folks you encountered. Our present system of schooling alienates us so sharply from our inner genius, most of us are barred from being able ever to hear our calling. Calling in most of us shrivels to fantasy and daydreams as a remnant of what might have been. The third characteristic of Christ's model of discipleship was self-awareness and independence. Christ's disciples were not stooges. They had to think for themselves and draw their own conclusions from the shared experience. Christ didn't give lectures or handouts. He taught by example, by His own practice, and through parables which were open to interpretation. Orrin, my coach, personally doubts that Christ ever intended to start a school or an institutional religion, for institutions invariably corrupt ideas unless they are kept small. Christ's followers started the church, not Christ. And finally, Christ's model of discipline requires a master to follow who has himself or herself submitted to discipline and still practices it. Christ didn't say, you guys stay here in the desert and fast for a month. I'll be over at the Ramada. You can find me in the bar if you need help. He did not begin his own public life until he was himself a rabbi, one fully versed in his tradition. One way out of the fix we're in with schools would be a return to discipleship and education, During early adolescence, students without a clear sense of calling might have a series of apprenticeships and mentorships which mostly involve self-education. Our students have pressing needs to be alone with themselves on quests to test themselves against obstacles, both the internal ones, the personal demons, and the external barricades to self-direction. As it is, we currently drown students in low-level busy work, shove them together in forced associations which teach them to hate other people, not to love them. We subject them to the filthiest, most pornographic regimen of constant surveillance and ranking, so they never experience the solitude and reflection necessary to become a whole man or woman. The net effect of holding a child in confinement for 12 years and longer without any honor paid to the spirit is an extended demonstration the state considers the Western God tradition to be dangerous. And of course it is. Schooling is about creating loyalty to an abstract central authority, and no serious rival can be welcome in a school that includes mother and father, tradition, local custom, self-management, or God. Despirited schooling has been tested and found fully wanting. I personally think that that's because it is a liar's game that denies the metaphysical reality recognized by men and women worldwide today and in every age. One of the great ironies of Chelsea Clinton's schooling at Sidwell Friends School is that she is compelled to study Quaker history and participate in Quaker meeting. For Chelsea, it was take it or leave it at Sidwell. She seems to have survived that compulsion to learn a religion not her own. An amusing aside, and you don't hear any amusement in my voice, but sometimes you do when I get more sleep, is that the difficulty with rational thought, however valuable a tool it certainly is that it misses the deepest properties of human nature, our feelings of loneliness and incompletion, our sense of sin, our need to love, our longing after immortality. Schooling is an instrument to disseminate this bleak and sterile vision of a blind chance universe. When schooling is able to displace education, as happened in the U.S. just about a century ago, a deterministic world could be simulated. We can entrap children into becoming organic machinery simply by ignoring the universal human awareness that there is something dreadfully important beyond the rational. We can cause children to mistrust themselves so severely they come to depend on cost-benefit analyses for everything. We can teach them to scorn faith so comprehensively, that's the way they do it at Yale Divinity School, that buying things and feeling good becomes the point of their lives. The Soviet Empire did this brilliantly for a little over 70 years. Its surveillance of individual lives was total. It maintained dossiers on each human unit, logged every deviation and assigned a mathematical value so that citizens could be ranked against each other. Does that sound familiar? It schooled every child in a fashion prescribed by the best psychological experts. It strictly controlled the rewards of work to ensure compliance, and it developed a punishment system unheard of in its comprehensiveness. If you want to ever explore that, read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. We first encounter a description of these problems in the Hebrew Bible, arising as universal punishments for the disobedience of Adam and Eve. Even if you believe yourself too sophisticated to accept this story at face value, it matters little to my accounting, because it is certain that you do share these burdens with believers, as you'll soon see. What I'm speaking of is original sin, a concept which comes from the Christian interpretation of the book of Genesis, which has powerfully affected the shape of every Western institution in the past 1,500 years. The fallout from a millennium-long, often bloody debate about original sin was profound. Out of Genesis came 4 penalties which followed the expulsion from Eden. And if you'll forgive me some slight modernization of the Genesis account, I'll enumerate those burdens. First, it was labor. There was no need to work in Eden, but now we would have to care for ourselves. Next, there was an emotional penalty. There was no pain in Eden, but now our natures would be subject to being led astray, to overindulging, to feeling tremendous pain, even from natural acts like childbirth, whether we were good people or bad people. Third, there was the amazingly two-edged free will penalty, which included the right to choose evil, which would now lurk everywhere. Recall that in Eden, there was exactly one wrong thing to do. Now we would bear the constant stress of having to be morally wary or surrendering to sin. And lastly, and most important, we were assigned the limitation penalty. The term of human life would be strictly limited. Nobody escapes death. And the more you have in wealth, family, community, and friends, the more you will be tempted to curse God as you witness yourself day by day losing physical beauty and energy and eventually losing everything. If you know the book of Job, you'll have an idea what I mean. So that's some doom, I know you'll agree. The question is what to do about it. Since these penalties exist in a religious universe, but they also exist as matter-of-fact, everyday material realities, 2 different answers emerged depending upon how intensely one group or the other felt the spiritual pull. I'll start with the group that cast its lot on the racehorse of shrewdness, calculation, and science to find a way out, because that group has commanded forced schooling, our economy, our technology, and our public philosophy for over a century. Here is its response to the challenge of original sin. On work. Work is a necessary evil, but for the smart, it is a curse which can be avoided. Machines and electronic slaves are making work obsolete. Only stupid people work. Hard hands are there for those who understand this. On pain, there are many scientific ways to avoid pain and enhance pleasure. Chemicals and other modern magic have made pain obsolete, and with it most problems of overindulgence. If you get drunk, mega doses of vitamin B will handle it. If you get fat, you can be liposucked. I'm ready for that. If you get old, there's plastic surgery. Grab for gusto. You only go around once. Good feelings are what life is about. There isn't anything else. On the third penalty, on good and evil, there is no such thing as good and evil. When Alger Hiss accepted the presidency of the World Health Organization in 1948, his initiatory address said that the problem of good and evil was an illusion, and it had caused more evil in the world than anything else and everything else put together. So I want to tie that to some living human being whose name you know. Every principle is negotiable. All ethics are situational. Nothing isn't relativistic. And you cannot know too much. With enough knowledge, you can duplicate the mythical God's powers. You can walk on water, you can fly, you can even create life. Did God destroy Sodom and Gomorrah with fire in the Hebrew Bible? Well, wake up. We turned the night sky over the Sinai just a few years ago into flame with a gasoline-air mixture which incinerated 100,000 retreating Iraqis in a matter of seconds. Only one of those, out of 6 of those people even had a weapon. We are God. At least the most evolutionarily advanced among us are, and you know where you find those, at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale Divinity School. And finally, on aging and death. Aging and death are the ultimate evils. But magic is available in the form of pills, potions, lotions, surgery, aerobics to stave off sickness and extend life. Young is the name of the game when it's all said and done, so aging must be concealed as long as possible through dress, speech, personal training regimens, and attitude makeovers. We only live once, and life is the highest value, so it follows that the health industry holds the ultimate wisdom around which we should center our attention. Every day, science gets closer and closer to making life eternal. You see how easy it can be done to repudiate the penalties of original sin. Ideologically speaking, that was the main mission of forced schooling, to redirect loyalty away from God and those who lived in a godly fashion by the Western Christian tradition to believe in corporate industry and specialized intelligence. What Western spirituality taught was much different. Rather than avoiding the punishments, it asked you to embrace them. It taught the marvelous paradox that willing acceptance of these burdens was the only way to a good, full life, the only way to inner peace. By bending your head in obedience, it would be raised up strong, brave, indomitable, and wise. And now let me go through the same list of penalties. On work, the religious voice said that work was the only avenue to genuine self-respect. Work develops independence, self-reliance, resourcefulness, and a host of other valuable things. Work itself is a value elevated far above a paycheck, above praise, above accomplishment. Work produces a spiritual reward unknown to the reinforcement schedules of behavioral psychologists like B.F. Skinner, but only if you tackle it gladly without resentment or avoidance, whether you're digging a ditch or building a skyscraper. In accepting the secular aversion to work as a thing to be rationalized away, as schools do, a horrifying problem was created in our society, which has proven so far to be incurable. The psychological, social, and spiritual anxieties which arise when you have no useful work to do, phony work, no matter how well paid or praised it is, causes such great emotional distortions to emerge that the major efforts of our civilization will soon be going into solving them, but with no hint of an answer in sight. In the economy we have allowed to evolve, the real political dilemma everywhere is keeping people occupied. Jobs have to be invented by government agencies and corporations, and both employ millions and millions of people for which they have no real use. It's an inside secret in the top echelon of CEOs that the minute you want to exercise your stock options, all you need to cause a sharp rise in the stock is to lay off 40,000 people, and that is done regularly and cynically, independent of bottom lines. I read Fortune, too. Young men and women during their brightest, orneriest, and most energetic years are kept from working or from being a part of the general society as they were in Ben Franklin's day. This is done to keep them from aggravating this work situation, either by working too eagerly, as kids are prone to do, or by inventing their own work, which could cause a cataclysm in the economy. The violation of the injunction to work, which Western spirituality imposed, has backed us into a corner from which no authority has any idea how to extricate us. We cannot afford to let children learn to work as Amish children do, for fear they will discover one of the great secrets of human history, that work is not a curse, but a salvation. Western spiritual... Thank you. I'll wipe my... So the second penalty we want to talk about is pain. On pain, Western spirituality has always regarded pain as a friend, because it forces attention off the things of this world and puts it squarely back into the center of the universe, which is you. Pain and distress in all its forms is the way we learn self-control, among other valuable lessons. But as existence becomes less locally centered, the siren call of feel-good lures us to court sensations and despise pain as a spoiler of pleasure. Western spirituality teaches that pain is the road to self-knowledge, that self-knowledge is the road to trusting yourself, that without such trust you cannot like yourself, without such self-liking you can never dependably love another or love God. The third penalty, good and evil. Western spirituality demands you write your own script through the world. In a spiritual being, everything is morally charged. Nothing is neutral. No excuses are accepted. Choosing is a daily burden, but one which makes you fully alive, because literally everything then becomes a big deal. I heard secondhand very recently about a woman who said to her mother about an affair she was conducting openly, despite the protest of her husband, and in full knowledge of her 6-year-old daughter, that it's no big deal. That's what she said to her mother. But if infidelity, divorce, and the shattering of innocence in a child isn't a big deal, then what could ever be one? By intensifying our moral sense, we feel the exhilaration of being alive in a universe where everything is a big deal. To have a real life, you must bring as many choices as you can out of the pre-programmed mode and under the conscious command of your will. The bigger the life you seek, the less anything can be made automatic, as if you were only a piece of machinery. And because every choice has a moral dimension, it will incline toward one or the other pole of that classic dichotomy that people hate to hear about, good and evil. Despite any extenuating circumstances, and they are legion, I know, the accumulating record of our choices marks us as worthy or as unworthy people. Even if nobody else is aware how your accounts stand, this is this marvelous Jesuitical subtlety. Deep inside, the running balance will vitally affect your ability to trust, to love, to gain peace and wisdom from your relationships and your community. And finally, on aging and death. In the Western spiritual tradition, which grew out of a belief in original sin, the focus was primarily on the lesson that nothing in this world is more than an illusion. This is only a stage on some longer journey we do not understand. To fall in love with your physical beauty or your wealth, your health, your power to experience good feelings is to kid yourself, because they will be taken away. The only thing that gives our time on earth any deep significance is that none of this will last. Only that temporality gives our relationships any urgency and passion, makes our choices matter. If you were indestructible, what a curse! How could it possibly matter whether you did anything today or next year or in the next 100 years, learned anything, loved anybody? There would always be time for everything and anything. What would be the big deal? Everyone has had the experience of having too much candy. I wrote here, or too much sex, but I'm going to take that out. Or too much company. Or even too much money. So much that no individual purchase can involve real choices, because real choices always close the door on other choices. I know that you would all like to have endless amounts of money, but the truth is it wipes out your ability to choose, since you can choose everything. That's what the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius discovered for himself in his reflections on what really matters, none of which is for sale. In the Meditations has become one of the greatest classics in Western history. If you don't believe anything else I've said, read the Meditations. Time, too, can hang heavily. Look at millions of bored school children. They know. And the corrective for this boredom, is full spiritual awareness that time is finite. As you spend it on one thing, you lose the chance forever to spend it on something else. It is a big deal. Science cannot help with time. In fact, living scientifically so as not to waste time, becoming one of those poor souls who never goes anywhere without a list, is the best guarantee that your life will be eaten up by errands, and that none of those errands will ever become the big deal that you desperately need to finally love yourself. Because the list of things to do will go ever onward and onward. The best lives are full of contemplation, full of solitude, full of self-examination, full of private, personal attempts to engage the metaphysical mystery of existence. The way we can make the best of our limited time by alternating effort with reflection, and reflection completely free of the get-something motive. Whenever I see a kid daydreaming in school, I'm careful never to shock the reverie out of existence. Buddha is reputed to have said, "Do nothing, time is too precious to waste." If that advice seems impossible in the world described in the evening news, reflect on the awesome fact that in spite of the hype, you still live on a planet where 67% of the world's entire population has never made or received a single phone call yet. If I seem to have stepped away from original sin with these facts, it is not so. Until you can acknowledge that the factual contents of your mind upon which you base decisions have been inserted there by others whose motives you cannot fully understand, you will never come to appreciate the neglected genius of Western spirituality, which teaches that you are the center of the universe and that the most important things worth knowing are innate in you already. They cannot be learned through schooling. They are self-taught through the burdens of having to work, having to sort out right from wrong, having to find a way to check your appetites, and having to age and die. The effect of this formula on world history has been titanic. It brought every citizen in the West a mandate to be sovereign, which we still have not learned to use wisely, but which offers the potential of such wisdom the moment we figure out a way to put the neo-aristocracy of global business, global government, and massive institutions back into the Pandora's box where they belong. Western spirituality granted every single individual a purpose for being alive, one independent of mass behavior, prescriptions, money, experts, governments. It conferred significance to every aspect of relationship and community. It carried inside its ideas the seeds of a self-activating curriculum which gives meaning to time. In Western spirituality, everyone counts. It offers a basic, matter-of-fact set of practical guidelines, street lamps for the village of your life. Nobody has to wander aimlessly in the universe of Western spirituality. What constitutes a meaningful life is clearly spelled out. Self-knowledge, duty, responsibility, acceptance of aging and loss, preparation for death. In the neglected genius of the West, no teacher or guru does the work for you. You must do it for yourself. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.